I have spent my career cataloging dead civilizations. I have recorded their last signals, filed their final coordinates, and sealed their archives with dates that no one will ever update. I have done this for 400 years, across 900 worlds, and I have never once been wrong about the dead. Until Earth. The alarm hit every ship, station, and outpost in the Galactic Concord at the same time. I was in the Central Archive on Thesara, alone with my records, when my terminal went white and every emergency frequency screamed to life. The sound was not a distress signal. It was not a weapon signature. It was a pulse, a single wave of structured energy radiating outward from a star system that had been dark for 250 years. Sol, the human system. I dropped the data tablet I was holding and stared at the readout. The pulse was enormous. It had crossed 60 light-years in a matter of hours, which was already impossible, and it carried encoded information in every known Concord language simultaneously. Not a translation, not a broadcast aimed at one species and then adapted for others. Every language, at the same time, woven into the signal like threads in a rope. One word. Ready. My hands were shaking. I had not felt fear like that since I was young, and I did not understand why I felt it now. It was just a word, but it came from a grave. It came from a system the entire galaxy had written off as dead, and it arrived with the casual confidence of someone knocking on your door after you had already buried them. I need to explain what Earth was, because most of the galaxy has forgotten. Humans made contact with the Galactic Concord roughly 340 years ago. They were not the most advanced species we had encountered, and they were not the least. They had faster-than-light travel, but it was crude. They had energy weapons, but nothing that would frighten a Drenari patrol cruiser. What they had, more than anything, was noise. They talked constantly. They broadcast music into open space. They sent diplomatic envoys to species that had not asked for them. They formed trade agreements with civilizations that barely tolerated their presence. They were loud and eager, and slightly exhausting, the way a young animal is exhausting when it follows you around and refuses to sit still. They joined the Concord and traded actively for about 90 years. They were minor members, neither powerful nor irrelevant. They contributed to joint scientific projects. They participated in cultural exchanges. They adopted alien orphans, which disturbed some species and charmed others. They argued in council sessions, and apologized afterward, and then argued again the following day. And then they stopped. There was no warning, no crisis, no visible catastrophe. One day Earth was transmitting on every frequency, and the next it was quiet. The final message arrived 250 years before the pulse. I was a junior clerk at the time, barely a century old, sorting records in a basement office. The message was not dramatic. It was not a cry for help or a declaration of war. It was a formal notice, polite and brief, stating that Earth was restructuring internal priorities and requesting a period of non-contact. That was it. Restructuring internal priorities. As if a civilization of 12 billion people had simply decided to take a long lunch. My supervisor at the time was a Telvari elder named Kasrin. When the message came through, she read it, filed it, and said something I have never forgotten. They will either come back or they will not. Either way, it is not our concern. She was wrong, of course, but it took 250 years to prove it. The silence was total. No signals, no trade ships, no communication of any kind. The Concord sent 3 expeditions to investigate over the following century, and each one ended badly. The first expedition departed 30 years after the silence began. It was a small scientific survey, 4 ships, 20 crew, led by a Mellery astrophysicist named Dr. Oreen, who had published several papers on human stellar engineering and considered herself an expert on their capabilities. She was not prepared for what she found. The expedition reached the outer boundary of the Sol system and reported anomalous energy readings at the heliosphere. Something is different about the edge of the system, Orion reported in her final transmission. Something structural has changed. We are detecting a boundary that should not be here. It is not natural. It is not any form of technology we recognize. We are detecting what appears to be a solid surface where open space should exist. They requested additional scanning equipment and extended mission parameters. The Concord dispatched the equipment. It arrived at the rendezvous coordinates 6 weeks later and found nothing. No ships, no debris, no energy residue, no trace that 4 vessels and 20 scientists had ever existed. The official report listed them as lost to unknown causes. I read that report 17 times over the following decades, looking for something I might have missed. I never found it. The second expedition was military. 85 years into the silence, the Concorde sent a Drenari battlecruiser with a full sensor array and enough firepower to crack a small moon. The battlecruiser reached the Sol system, performed a long-range scan, and transmitted a single image before it also went silent. The image showed the outer solar system: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, the gas giants that had been mapped and catalogued decades earlier. They were gone. Not destroyed, not displaced, gone. The space where they had been was empty, clean, as if someone had reached into the solar system and plucked them out like fruit from a bowl. The image circulated through the Concorde's intelligence networks for about a year before it was classified. The official explanation was sensor malfunction. No one believed it. No one wanted to think about what the alternative meant. The Concorde did not send a third expedition. They held a vote instead. 312 species participated. The motion was simple: classify Sol as a quarantine zone, prohibited space, no entry, no contact, no exceptions. The vote passed with less than 10 minutes of debate. I watched the proceedings from my archive. Not a single delegate argued against the motion. They were relieved. They wanted a locked door between themselves and whatever was happening in that system, and they got one. And the galaxy forgot about Earth. It is remarkable how quickly a civilization can be erased from collective memory when there is no one left to remind you it existed. Within a generation, humans were gone from the textbooks. Within 2 generations, they were gone from casual conversation. The trade routes they had helped establish were renamed. The cultural exchange programs they had participated in were archived and closed. The alien orphans they had adopted grew old and died, and their stories were recorded by nobody except me. I kept every record, every trade manifest, every diplomatic note, every minor cultural artifact that passed through Concorde channels with a human signature attached. I filed them in chronological order, and I maintained them with the same care I gave to every other extinct civilization in my archive, because that is what I believed they were: extinct. I did not forget. It was my job to maintain the file, and I maintained it. I updated it every decade with the same notation: no change, no signal, no contact. The file grew thinner over the centuries, not thicker. Other archivists stopped asking me about it. New species joined the Concorde and had never heard of humans. Old species remembered them vaguely, the way you remember a neighbor who moved away when you were young. Earth became a cautionary tale, a ghost story for young diplomats. Even the loud ones go quiet eventually. But I kept the file open, perhaps because the silence was too clean. When civilizations die, they leave wreckage. They leave refugees and distress signals and fragmentary transmissions begging for help. They leave broken ships drifting in the dark. Earth left nothing. It was not the silence of death. It was the silence of a closed door. And now, 250 years later, the door had spoken. I was summoned to the High Chamber within the hour. The High Chamber is the largest enclosed space in Concorde territory. A vaulted hall carved into the heart of Thesara Station, large enough to seat representatives from every member species. I had been inside it perhaps a dozen times in my career, always as an observer, always at the margins. It was a space designed to remind you that you were small, that the Concorde was vast, and that decisions made here shaped the lives of trillions. Today it was not impressive. Today it was terrified. The chamber was full, every seat occupied, every species represented. The noise was enormous, a wall of competing languages and frequencies and pheromone signals. The central display showed the pulse signature on a loop. Ready, ready, ready. Admiral Korath of the Drenari was standing at the command podium. He was old, even by Drenari standards, his scaled face lined with scars from conflicts most of the chamber had already forgotten. He was the highest-ranking military officer in the Concorde, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. "The archivist Valen will now present the historical record," he said. I walked to the podium and told them everything. The final message, the expeditions, the missing planets, the quarantine vote, the decades of nothing. I told them that Earth's file was classified under self-terminated, probable, and that I had maintained that classification for over 2 centuries because there was no evidence to support any other conclusion. And then I told them that I was wrong. The pulse is not a weapon, I said. It is not a distress signal. It is structured communication, encoded in every Concord language simultaneously. Whoever sent it knew our languages, all of them, and had the capability to embed them into a single transmission that crossed 60 light-years in a fraction of the expected time. That last detail silenced the chamber. 60 light-years in hours. Our fastest ships would take weeks. Korath asked the question that everyone was thinking. What do they want? They said ready, I told him. I believe they are waiting for us to respond. The chamber erupted. Half the delegates wanted to send a fleet. The other half wanted to reinforce the quarantine. The Vresi wanted to bombard the Sol system from maximum range and ask questions later. Korath let them argue for 20 minutes. Then he raised one scarred hand, and the chamber went silent. We will go, he said. All of us. And we will find out what they have been doing in the dark for 250 years. I returned to my office that night and sat alone with the file. I deleted the last entry and typed a new one. Signal received, classification pending. I closed the file and waited for the morning, when the fleet would begin to assemble, and I would leave my archive for the first time in 100 years. I was not ready. But then again, I had spent my entire career studying civilizations that ended. I had never been asked to study one that came back. The Concord assembled its fleet in 9 days. That alone should tell you how frightened they were. Standard mobilization for a joint operation takes months. Committees must approve the deployment. Species must negotiate which ships to send and who commands them. Budgets must be argued over, and revised and argued over again. The bureaucracy of the Concord is legendary, a machine designed to move slowly so that no single species can drag the others into a war. 9 days. 40 ships from 12 species, anchored in formation above Thesara Station. Drenari warships with their angular hulls and heavy batteries. Malori science vessels, sleek and pale, bristling with sensor arrays. Telvari diplomatic cruisers, including the one I was assigned to, built for endurance and negotiation rather than combat. Vresi interceptors, small and fast and armed with weapons designed to punch through shielding at close range. Kaylani long-range scouts, their hulls covered in the bioluminescent patterns that served as both navigation systems and cultural identity markers. Others I did not recognize, from species that rarely left their own territories and had been drawn out by the same fear that pulled the rest of us together. Admiral Korath commanded from his flagship, the Tidebreaker. I was assigned to the Telvari cruiser Quiet Vigil as Chief Historical Advisor, a title that sounded important and meant I was there to answer questions about a species no one had seen in a quarter of a millennium. I boarded the ship with a single travel case and my archive terminal, and I stood at the observation port as the fleet broke orbit and turned toward a star 60 light-years away. The journey would take 3 weeks at maximum transit speed. 3 weeks of empty space and nervous waiting, and the low hum of engines pushing us towards something that every instinct told us to avoid. The mood aboard the Quiet Vigil was tense, in a way I had not experienced before. The crew spoke in low voices. Meals were eaten quickly and silently. The observation ports, which were normally popular gathering spots during long transits, were empty. No one wanted to look at the stars and think about what might be waiting at the end of the journey. I spent my evenings in the ship's small library, surrounded by data terminals and the faint hum of the environmental systems, and I read everything I could find about the species we were going to visit. Or investigate. Or confront. No one had decided which word to use yet. I spent the first week reviewing everything the Concord had on record about humanity. Trade logs, cultural exchanges, scientific publications, diplomatic correspondence. I read old reports from ambassadors who had visited Earth, their impressions of the planet's chaotic cities and noisy markets, and the unsettling way humans would look you in the eye and smile as if they knew something you did not. I read trade manifests listing goods humanity had exported. Tools, music, biological samples from their ecosystems, educational materials, handmade crafts that Concord diplomats had received as gifts and catalogued with polite bewilderment. One manifesto recorded the export of something called a quilt, a decorative blanket made from scraps of old fabric sewn together by hand. The Mellery trade assessor had classified it as primitive textile waste. The quilt was beautiful. I saw images of it in the archive. Someone had spent hundreds of hours assembling it, and the pattern told a story if you knew how to read it, which no one in the Concord did, because no one had bothered to ask. But there was something in the scientific records that nagged at me, something that had been buried under the routine. In the final decade before the silence, human scientific output had tripled. Not gradually, not as part of a slow upward trend. A sudden, sharp increase, as if someone had thrown a switch. Papers on theoretical physics, energy manipulation, spatial geometry, thermodynamic modeling. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They were published openly, submitted to Concord research databases, available to anyone who cared to read them. Almost no one had. I pulled up the review logs. The papers had been flagged by Concord peer reviewers and dismissed uniformly. The criticism was consistent across every reviewer and every species. The mathematical frameworks did not correspond to any Concord standard. The notation was unfamiliar. The conclusions were speculative. One reviewer, a Mellery physicist named Serene, had written a single line in her assessment that I found 300 years later in the archive. Interesting ideas. Unsound methodology. Not recommended for further study. I loaded the old equations into my ship's processing core, which was considerably more powerful than anything available when those papers were first submitted. The Quiet Vigil's computer was a fifth-generation Telvari analytical engine, capable of modeling complex systems that would have overwhelmed the processors of 3 centuries ago. The processor ran for 6 hours. I sat in my cabin and watched the progress bar crawl forward, and felt the ship vibrate gently beneath me as it pushed through the emptiness between stars. The progress bar reached its end. The processor returned a result. But it was not a result. It was an error code, and the error message said something I had never seen in 400 years of working with computational systems. Solution exceeds known physical constants. I ran it again, same result. I ran it a third time with expanded parameters, giving the processor permission to extrapolate beyond the Concord's established physical models. The processor ran for 12 more hours and returned a partial solution that filled my screen with numbers and relationships that I could not interpret, but that my computer flagged as internally consistent. The math was not wrong. The math was correct. It simply described operations that our physics said were impossible. I ran the equations through 3 more configurations, each time expanding the processor's freedom to extrapolate. Each time the results came back consistent, internally coherent, and completely outside the boundaries of known science. It was like finding a map to a country that every atlas said did not exist, drawn in precise detail, with roads and rivers and cities clearly labeled, and realizing that the country had been there all along but no one had looked in the right direction. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I understood something that changed the shape of everything that followed. The Concord had not ignored human science because it was wrong. They had ignored it because they could not understand it. And by the time anyone might have taken a second look, Earth had already gone silent, and the file had been sealed, and no one cared about the speculative papers of a dead civilization. I brought my findings to Sanara Voss, the Mellery chief scientist on our ship. She was young for a Mellery, sharp and skeptical, the kind of researcher who treated every claim as guilty until proven innocent. She had been assigned to the mission because her superiors considered it a waste of time, and she was junior enough to be expendable. She did not know yet that this mission would define the rest of her career. She reviewed the equations for 2 days without sleeping, which is not unusual for a Mellery, but alarmed the medical staff. She filled her cabin with handwritten notes and holographic models and empty nutrient containers. When she finally emerged, she looked different. Not frightened exactly. Rewritten, as if the equations had reached into her understanding of the universe and rearranged the furniture. These equations describe operations on space-time itself, she told me. Not movement through space. Not energy generation. Not manipulation of matter. They describe the ability to alter the fundamental structure of reality at a level that our physics does not acknowledge exists. If these are correct, and I am not yet willing to say they are, then the civilization that produced them is not merely advanced. It is operating in a category we do not have a name for. What category would you suggest? I asked. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a Mellery before. It took me a moment to recognize it as humility, an emotion that Mallory do not experience naturally, and therefore find deeply uncomfortable. "The category above us," she said. I shared her findings with Korath through the fleet channel. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for a Drenari, and when I finished, he was silent for almost a full minute. Then he said something that I recorded in my journal, because it captured the mood of the entire fleet in a single sentence. "I have fought 37 engagements in my career," he said. "I have never once approached an enemy I could not understand. I do not know what we are flying toward, but I know that we will not turn back." The fleet reached the Sol system on the 19th day. I was on the bridge of the quiet vigil when the long-range sensors activated, and I watched the data populate the tactical display, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I think was the death of every assumption I had ever held about what was possible. The heliosphere was gone. The heliosphere is the boundary of a star's influence, the outer edge of the solar wind, a diffuse and gradual thinning of energy that marks where a star system ends and interstellar space begins. Every star has one. It is as natural and expected as a coastline. Sol's heliosphere had been replaced. In its place was a shell. A hard, smooth, uniform barrier enclosing the entire star system, approximately 100 astronomical units in diameter. It was not made of any material in the Concorde's database. It was not emitting energy. It was not reflecting light or absorbing radiation, or interacting with the interstellar medium in any detectable way. It was simply there, a wall around a star, perfect and seamless, and vast beyond comprehension. I tried to grasp the scale of it and failed. 100 astronomical units is roughly 14 billion kilometers. The shell enclosed a volume of space so large that our entire fleet could have spent years exploring its exterior surface without covering a meaningful fraction of it. And it was smooth. Not the rough, pitted surface of an asteroid, or the layered complexity of a planetary atmosphere. Smooth the way mathematics is smooth. Smooth the way a perfect equation is smooth. It had been designed, and the designer had not made a single error that our instruments could detect. The bridge went silent. 40 ships hung in formation before a barrier that dwarfed anything any of us had ever seen, and no one said a word. I could hear the hum of the life support systems, and the faint clicking of Korath's claws on his command console aboard the Tidebreaker, transmitted through the open fleet channel. Then Korath gave the order to launch a probe. The probe was a standard Drenari reconnaissance unit, fast, expendable, packed with sensors. It accelerated toward the shell, transmitting telemetry in real time. We watched it cross the final kilometers. It reached the shell, and passed through. Not through a door, or a gap, or a weak point. Through the shell itself, as if the barrier had simply decided to allow it entry. One moment, the probe was outside, transmitting readings of a solid surface with no identifiable composition, and the next it was inside, transmitting readings of something else entirely. The transition was instantaneous. There was no deceleration, no buffering zone, no airlock or membrane. The shell simply parted and closed again, and the probe continued as if nothing had happened. Except everything had happened, because the readings on the other side were not the readings of a dead system, or an empty system, or even a normal system. They were the readings of something that should not exist. The probe's telemetry continued without interruption. Interior readings flooded the tactical display, and I heard Sonara Voss inhale sharply beside me. The Kailani navigator made a sound that I had never heard from her species before, a low vibration that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. The communications officer turned to look at me, and his face held an expression that I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror every day for 250 years. It was the expression of someone who has just realized that everything they believed about a particular subject was wrong. I read the data aloud because someone had to say it, and no one else seemed able to. Interior contains approximately 9,000 artificial structures. No natural planetary bodies detected. Atmospheric composition of interior volume is Earth standard oxygen-nitrogen mix. Temperature is regulated. Gravity is variable by sector. I stopped reading. The bridge crew was staring at the display with expressions I will remember for the rest of my life. The Kailani navigator had placed both hands flat on her console, as if she needed to hold on to something solid. The Telvari communications officer had closed his eyes. Sonara Voss was gripping the railing in front of her with both hands, her knuckles white. They had taken the planets apart, every one of them. Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, the rocky inner worlds, the asteroid belt. Every natural body that had once orbited this star had been dismantled and rebuilt into 9,000 structures, arranged in geometric precision, and they had filled the interior of the shell with breathable air and managed gravity, as if the entire solar system were not a collection of orbiting worlds, but a single enormous room. A room the size of a solar system, built by a species the galaxy had forgotten. Korath opened the fleet-wide channel. His voice was steady, but I knew him well enough by then to hear the effort behind the steadiness. "All ships hold position," he said. "We are going in." The fleet moved forward, 40 ships from 12 species, carrying the combined military and scientific might of the Galactic Concord, approaching a shell that should not exist around a star system that should have been dead. The shell let us through without resistance, as if it had been waiting. And what we found on the other side made everything we thought we knew about the universe feel very, very small. The interior of the Sol system was not a solar system anymore. I need to say that clearly, because the words I am about to use will sound like exaggeration, and they are not. I have visited 900 worlds. I have cataloged civilizations that built cities in the cores of gas giants, and species that wove their homes from the magnetic fields of neutron stars. I have seen things that would overwhelm the minds of lesser archivists, and recorded them with steady hands and precise language. Nothing prepared me for this. The planets were gone. All of them. Mercury, Venus, Mars, the gas giants, the dwarf planets, the asteroid belt. Every natural body that had once orbited this modest yellow star had been taken apart, molecule by molecule, and rebuilt into something else. In their place, arranged in concentric rings around the sun, like the layers of a living machine, were structures, thousands of them. Some were habitats, enormous cylinders and spheres, with transparent walls through which I could see forests, oceans, cities glowing with soft light. Some were machines of a kind I could not identify, vast geometric forms rotating slowly in the regulated gravity. Their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. Some were gardens, open-air ecosystems exposed to what should have been the vacuum of space, except there was no vacuum anymore, because the entire interior of the shell was pressurized and warm and breathable. The sun itself was different, not changed exactly, managed. A partial framework surrounded it, not a complete Dyson sphere, but something more elegant, a lattice of energy-conducting structures that wrapped around the star like fingers cupping a flame. The framework was not harvesting all the sun's energy. It was regulating it, smoothing the output, controlling the temperature and radiation levels throughout the interior volume, like a thermostat for a star. I stood at the observation port and tried to take it in, and failed. The human mind, and the Telvari mind for that matter, is not built to comprehend engineering at this scale. We can understand a city, we can understand a station, we can even understand a world, given enough time and enough maps. But a solar system rebuilt from scratch, every atom repurposed, every orbit recalculated, every natural process replaced with something designed and intentional, that is not engineering. That is something else. Something we did not have a word for, because no one had ever needed one. Our science officers began cataloging what they saw. They gave up within the first hour. Every structure they scanned operated on principles that were not in the Concord's scientific databases. The materials were unknown. The energy signatures were unknown. The mathematical relationships between the structures, the way they moved and interacted, and seemed to communicate with each other through patterns of light and gravity, defied every model we had. Sonara Voss was recording everything with a focus that bordered on desperation. She had 6 instruments running simultaneously, and she was muttering the same phrase under her breath in a continuous loop. This should not be possible. This should not be possible. I did not tell her that I agreed. An archivist is supposed to be calm. An archivist records. An archivist does not stand on the bridge of a diplomatic cruiser and feel the foundations of their understanding crack beneath their feet. But I felt them crack. Every moment I looked at what humanity had built in 250 years of silence, I felt another certainty dissolve. I had spent 4 centuries believing that I understood the boundaries of what civilizations could achieve. I had catalogued 900 worlds, and I had thought, with the quiet confidence of long experience, that I had seen the range of possibility. I had not. I had been standing in a small room and calling it the universe. Korath was scanning for military installations. I watched his tactical display from across the fleet channel and saw the same thing he saw. Nothing. No weapons platforms. No defense grids. No warships. No orbital batteries. No minefields. No kill zones. Nothing designed to destroy, threaten, or even inconvenience an incoming fleet. A civilization that could dismantle gas giants and restructure the interior of a star system. A civilization that had clearly surpassed every other species in the Concord by a margin that defied calculation, had not built a single weapon. I noted this in my journal. Humanity did not build a fortress. They built a laboratory. Korath noticed it too. I could hear the confusion in his voice when he reported to the fleet. No hostile signatures detected. Repeat, no hostile signatures. I am reading zero military infrastructure within the shell. He paused. His tactical training was fighting him. A Drenari admiral does not feel safe in a place with no weapons, because a place with no weapons either has no threats or has threats so far beyond weapons that they do not need them. Either answer should concern us, he said quietly, but we continue. We drifted deeper, past structures that made our largest stations look like pebbles beside mountains. I saw a habitat cylinder so large that its interior had weather systems. Clouds formed and dissolved inside it. Rain fell on forests that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and rivers ran through valleys that had been carved, not by geology, but by design. Through the transparent walls I could see birds in flight. I could see lakes reflecting the regulated sunlight. I could see what appeared to be a small city nestled against a hillside, its buildings low and warm and surrounded by gardens. People lived there. Humans, living ordinary lives inside a structure that was anchored in the orbit of a managed star, inside a shell that enclosed what used to be a solar system. The contrast was staggering. The impossible scale of the engineering and the simple human lives it contained. On another ring, I saw machines that pulsed with frequencies our instruments could not categorize. They were enormous, each one the size of a moon, and they moved in synchronized patterns that suggested purpose and coordination, but whose function I could not guess. Sonara Voss stared at them for 20 minutes and then quietly announced that they appeared to be performing calculations, though what kind of calculations would require machines that large she could not say. She estimated their processing capacity at roughly 10,000 times the combined computational power of every Concord system in existence. She said this in a flat, controlled voice, and then she put down her instruments and sat very still for several minutes without speaking. I saw a ring of structures that appeared to be purely artistic, vast sculptures of light and engineered gravity, shapes that shifted and reformed, and cast shadows that moved independently of any light source. They served no practical function that our sensors could identify. They were beautiful, staggeringly, heartbreakingly beautiful. The kind of beauty that makes you realize your species has been calling things beautiful for millennia, without understanding what the word truly means. Humanity had not merely survived their isolation, they had continued to create art. They had continued to find beauty worth making, even when no one outside their shell would ever see it. That detail, more than the engines or the habitats or the managed star, told me who these people were. We had been inside the shell for approximately 2 hours, when a small vessel detached from one of the inner ring structures and moved toward the fleet. It was graceful, smooth and organic looking, like something grown rather than built. It had no visible engines, no exhaust ports, no external features of any kind, except a smooth, slightly iridescent hull that caught the sunlight and scattered it into soft rainbows. It was unarmed. Our sensors confirmed it 3 times, because no one believed the first 2 readings. The vessel broadcast an audio message on an open channel. The voice was human, female, slightly accented Concord Common, the trade language used across the galaxy. But the accent was warm and the tone was casual, almost playful, and that unsettled me more than any weapon ever had. Hello, old friends. We have been expecting you. Please, come and see what we have been working on. The bridge crew looked at me. I was the human expert, the man who had kept the file open for 250 years. They wanted me to tell them what to do. I have studied dead civilizations my entire life, I said. This one is not dead. I recommend we accept the invitation. Korath agreed. A diplomatic shuttle was prepared. I insisted on joining the delegation, and no one argued, possibly because no one else wanted to go first. The shuttle carried 7 of us. Myself, Sinara Voss, a Drenari security officer named Lieutenant Dren, who carried himself with the careful stillness of someone who expected danger from every direction. A Kailani linguist named Tora, whose bioluminescent patterns were cycling through colors I had never seen before, which I later learned indicated a state of profound cognitive dissonance. A Melari medical officer. 2 Telvari diplomats who looked even more uncomfortable than I felt. We followed the human vessel inward, past rings of structures that dwarfed anything the Concord had ever built, past gardens that stretched across thousands of kilometers, past machines that hummed with energies my instruments could not name. The scale was crushing. Every time I thought I had adjusted to the size of what I was seeing, we passed something larger, and my sense of proportion collapsed again like a building with its foundations removed. I pressed my face to the shuttle window and watched a structure pass below us that appeared to be a single, continuous body of water, held in shape by managed gravity, orbiting the sun like a liquid planet. Fish were visible through the surface. Something that looked like a whale breached and fell back, sending ripples across a sea that floated in open space. Lieutenant Dren, who had been maintaining a professional silence since we boarded the shuttle, looked at the floating ocean and said, very quietly, "That is not possible." Tora placed a hand on his arm and her patterns pulsed a gentle amber, which I later learned meant, "I know." We docked at a station near the inner rings. It was the size of a small moon, its surface covered in what appeared to be living vegetation, green and gold, and reaching toward the regulated sunlight. The docking port opened smoothly and sealed behind us with a gentle hiss. Air rushed in, warm, clean, the smell of growing things, soil and leaves and something floral I did not recognize. Somewhere, faintly, I heard water running. It sounded like a stream, inside a station, orbiting a star, and standing at the dock, waiting for us with the patience of someone who had been expecting guests for a very long time, was a human. She was tall and calm. She appeared to be about 40 years old by human standards, though I knew better than to trust that estimate. Her hair was dark, cut short, and her eyes were steady and clear. She wore simple clothing, practical and unadorned. No uniform, no insignia, no visible technology of any kind. She looked, by every surface measure, like an ordinary human being. The kind of person you might have met in a market on old Earth 3 centuries ago. She was not ordinary. I knew it the moment she looked at me, and I saw her eyes track every member of our delegation simultaneously, each of us independently, without her gaze appearing to move. She processed 7 alien body language systems at once, and adjusted her posture subtly for each of us. Open hands for the Telvari, squared shoulders for the Drenari, a slight lowering of the chin for the Kailani. She did all of this in the space of 2 seconds, and made it look effortless. "My name is Marin Cole," she said. "I am one of several coordinators. Welcome to Seoul." Her Concord Common was perfect. Then she turned to Sinara Voss and spoke fluent Melari, a language with 17 grammatical cases and mandatory tonal inflection. Then Drenari, to Lieutenant Dren, complete with the military register that most non-Drenari speakers never master. Then Kailani, to Tora, a language so tonal and complex that most translation software cannot render it accurately. Marin spoke it as if she had been born to it, and Tora's bioluminescent patterns shifted to a deep, steady blue that I later learned signified awe. She saw our faces and smiled, not with arrogance, but with the quiet warmth of a host who has waited a very long time for company and is genuinely glad to see it arrive. "You are wondering what we did," she said. "I would love to tell you, but it is easier to show you." She led us through corridors that smelled of cedar and rain, past windows that looked out onto structures I could not comprehend, through spaces that felt alive in a way I had never experienced in any artificial environment. The air moved gently with natural currents, not the forced circulation of a station's ventilation system. The light shifted with a rhythm that felt organic, like clouds passing over a sun, because that is exactly what it was. The station had weather, internal weather, managed and gentle, but real. We passed other humans along the way. They looked at us with curiosity but not surprise. Some smiled, some waved. A child, a girl of about 7 years old with dark curly hair and bare feet, stopped in the corridor and stared at Tora with undisguised fascination, her eyes wide at the shifting bioluminescent patterns. Tora knelt down to the child's level and pulsed a gentle sequence of colors that made the girl laugh and reach out to touch the light. Marin watched this exchange with an expression that told me more about what humanity had become than any scientific data could. They had not lost their warmth. They had not become cold or distant or detached in their isolation. 250 years alone, and a human child still reached out to touch something beautiful and strange without a moment of fear. I walked beside Marin. I had 1,000 questions. I started with the simplest one. Why did you go silent? She looked at me with those steady eyes, and I had the strange sensation that she was deciding how much to tell me. Not because she wanted to hide anything, but because she was choosing the gentlest way to say something enormous. Because we found a problem, she said, and it required our full attention. What problem? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she led us to a window, a vast transparent panel that stretched from floor to ceiling, and she gestured for us to look. Below us, suspended in the regulated gravity of the inner system, was a structure unlike anything else we had seen. It was not a habitat, or a machine, or a garden. It was a lattice of light and matter, vast and shifting, pulsing with a rhythm that was slow and deep and steady, like a heartbeat. Energy moved through it in patterns that my instruments registered as impossible. Matter folded and unfolded within it, changing state in ways that contradicted the known laws of physics. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the largest single structure I had ever seen, and it was alive with purpose. What is that? Sonara Voss whispered beside me. Marin Cole looked at the lattice, and her expression changed. The warmth was still there, but beneath it was something older and harder. Pride, perhaps. Or the memory of a cost so enormous that even pride could not quite cover it. She said 2 words, simple words, words that every species in the galaxy understood, because every species in the galaxy feared the thing they described. We solved entropy. The silence on that observation deck was the loudest silence I have ever experienced. 7 representatives of the Galactic Concord stood at the edge of everything they had ever believed and looked down at the thing that proved it was all about to change. Sonara Voss sat down on the floor. Lieutenant Dren placed one hand against the window, as if he needed it to stay upright. Tora's bioluminescent patterns went completely dark, which I later learned was the Kaylani equivalent of losing consciousness while remaining standing. I stood still and stared at the lattice, and felt the weight of 250 years of silence press against my chest like a hand. They had been here the entire time, behind their wall, in the dark, not dying, not hiding, working on the single most important problem in the history of the universe, and they had solved it, and now they were ready to tell us about it. Every species in the Concord had asked the same question at some point in their development. It is a question so fundamental that it is almost genetic, bred into the bones of any civilization that looks up at the stars long enough to understand what it is seeing. The question is simple: is the universe dying? The answer, for as long as any species had existed to ask, was yes. Entropy. The second law of thermodynamics, the slow, inevitable dispersal of energy from ordered to disordered states. Stars burn out, matter decays, heat dissipates. Given enough time, everything that exists will become nothing, not destroyed, simply spread so thin and so cold that the difference between something and nothing becomes meaningless. Every civilization in the Concord knew this. Most accepted it the way you accept gravity. It was the background condition of existence, the price of living in a universe that was, on the longest time scale, winding down. Some species built religions around it, some built philosophies. The Drenari developed an entire martial tradition based on the principle that all things end, and therefore the only honorable act is to fight well before the end arrives. The Melori incorporated entropy into their mathematics, treating it not as a problem, but as a boundary condition, a wall at the edge of all equations that could not be moved. Humans did not accept it. Marin Cole walked us through the history with the patience of a teacher who has been preparing this lesson for a very long time. She led us from the observation deck to a chamber deep inside the station, a room lined with displays that showed 250 years of work compressed into a single visual narrative. She spoke clearly and calmly, and she did not rush, and she did not simplify, and she did not condescend. She told us the truth, all of it, including the parts that were not triumphant. 260 years ago, she said, human physicists confirmed what many had suspected for centuries. The universe is dying, not quickly, not for billions of years, but with absolute certainty. Entropy cannot be reversed. That was the accepted position of every major scientific institution on Earth, and every member species of the Concord. The math was clear. The laws of thermodynamics were settled. She paused. We did not find them acceptable, she said. The displays behind her showed the early years. Research teams, scattered across Earth and its small colonies, working independently on the same problem. Papers published, arguments fought, funding begged for and denied and begged for again. The scientific establishment pushed back hard. You cannot reverse entropy. It is not a problem to be solved. It is a law to be obeyed. The humans who disagreed were not the establishment. They were the stubborn ones, the ones who refused to accept locked doors, the ones who looked at a fundamental law of the universe and said no, not this, not if we can help it. A physicist named Liam Blackwood wrote the founding paper. I saw his face on Marin's display, a thin man with tired eyes and ink stains on his fingers, sitting in a cluttered office surrounded by handwritten equations pinned to every wall. He had 2 children, Marin told us. He worked on his theory in the hours between their bedtimes and his own, scribbling equations on whatever surface was available, running calculations on outdated equipment that his university could barely afford to maintain. He published his theory 70 years before the silence began, and it was ignored by every major institution in the Concord, and most institutions on Earth. 3 reviewers rejected it. One called it elegant nonsense. Another said it showed promise but lacked experimental feasibility. The third did not finish reading it. The theory proposed that entropy was not a law but a behavior, a tendency of energy under certain conditions, and that those conditions could be altered if you understood the underlying structure of space-time well enough to change the rules. Blackwood died before the silence began. He never knew that his elegant nonsense would become the foundation of the largest engineering project in the history of the universe. His children knew. His daughter, Ruth Blackwood, became one of the first engineers on the Entropy project. She carried her father's original notebook into the sealed system when the shell closed, and it is still preserved in the central archive of the inner ring. Marin showed us an image of it, yellowed pages covered in cramped handwriting, and I thought about all the things that can grow from a single mind working alone in a small room. It was radical, it was dismissed, and it was correct. It took 20 more years of work before enough humans believed Blackwood's framework to form a coalition, and it took another 10 years before that coalition made a decision that would change the history of every living thing in the galaxy. They went to their governments, Marin said, all of them, every nation, every territory, every colony, and they said the same thing. We can save the universe, but it will cost everything we have and everything we are for the foreseeable future. We need to stop expanding. We need to stop trading. We need to dismantle our outer planets for raw material. We need to seal ourselves off from the galaxy so no one can interfere with the work or steal it before it is finished. And we need to go quiet. I tried to imagine it. A species, 12 billion strong, being asked to abandon everything they had built, every relationship they had formed, every connection to the wider galaxy, and turn inward. Shut the door. Go dark. Bet their entire civilization on a single idea that most physicists said was impossible. The vote was not unanimous, Marin said, and for the first time her composure shifted. Not close to unanimous. It was brutal. Families divided, communities fractured. There were protests, riots, political upheavals that lasted years. People who wanted to keep trading, keep exploring, keep living the way they had always lived, set against people who believed that none of it mattered if the universe was going to die anyway. She was quiet for a moment. The ones who believed won, she said, by a narrow margin, and the ones who lost Most of them stayed anyway, because whatever else humans are, we are not a species that abandons its own. The door closed, the shell went up, the signal stopped, Earth went dark. And then the real work began. I asked Marin what it cost. She looked at me, and for the first time since we had met her, the steadiness in her eyes cracked. Just slightly, just enough for me to see what was behind it, not weakness, grief. The first generation built the infrastructure, she said. They dismantled planets. They constructed the computational arrays and the energy frameworks and the fabrication systems. They worked themselves to exhaustion, and many of them died young, and they never saw a single result. They did it on faith, on the belief that the generation after them would take it further. A woman named Ellen Price led the planetary disassembly program. She oversaw the dismantling of Neptune, the first planet to be processed, and she turned its mass into the foundation of the outer ring structures. She died at 53. Her last recorded words were, "Tell the next shift the alignment tolerances are wrong," on Section 9. The second generation ran the experiments. Thousands of experiments. Millions. Most of them failed. Some of them failed catastrophically. There was an accident in the 73rd year that destroyed an entire habitat ring and killed 14,000 people in 6 seconds. Marin said the number without flinching, but her hands were tight at her sides. A man named Nathan Cross was the chief engineer on that ring. He survived the accident and spent the rest of his life redesigning the safety protocols to ensure it could never happen again. He succeeded. It never did. But the memorial for the 14,000 was the largest structure on the inner rings for over a century, until the entropy engine itself grew to surpass it. The third generation almost quit. The political fractures that had never fully healed reopened. A faction called the Open Door Movement demanded that the shell be taken down and contact with the Concorde restored. They argued that the project was a failure, a monument to arrogance, a tomb that their grandparents had built and their parents had sealed, and their children would die inside. The debates lasted 11 years. Communities turned on each other. Families that had held together through the first century of sacrifice broke apart. A man named George Calloway held it together, Marin said. He was not a scientist. He was not a politician. He was a teacher. He taught children on one of the inner ring habitats, and when the open door movement was at its peak, he walked into the Central Assembly and he said one thing. She paused. I could see her choosing whether to say the words or to summarize them. She said the words. He said, "If we open the door now, we will be comfortable. We will trade again. We will talk to the stars again. And in 10 billion years, every star will go out, and every species we traded with, and every child we taught, and every song we sang, will vanish, as if it never existed." He said, "I would rather my students inherit a universe that lasts than a civilization that quits." The assembly voted to continue. The open door movement dissolved. George Calloway died 8 years later without seeing the results of his stubbornness. His students carried his words forward, like a flame passed from hand to hand in the dark. The fourth generation cracked it. Marin brought us to the core structure, the lattice of light and matter we had seen from the observation window. Up close, it was even more staggering. The lattice occupied a volume larger than old Earth, a cathedral of energy and engineered space-time that pulsed with slow, patient rhythms. It was warm. I could feel it on my skin, a gentle heat that was not thermal, but something else, something deeper, as if the lattice were radiating possibility itself. "This is the engine," Marin said. "It reverses entropy on a local scale. Within its field, energy states can be reversed. Decay can be undone. Waste heat can be recaptured and reordered. Matter that has degraded can be restored to its original state." She led us to a small chamber adjacent to the main lattice. Inside was a sealed glass container. Inside the container was a flower. It was dead. Brown, withered, crumbling at the edges. A simple earth flower, unremarkable and lifeless. Marin pressed a control on the chamber wall. The lattice pulsed. The field around the container shifted. The flower bloomed. Not slowly, not like a recording played in reverse, but naturally, organically, as if time itself had changed its mind about the flower's death. The brown faded to green, the petals uncurled, soft and red, the stem straightened. In 30 seconds, the dead flower was alive, vibrant, perfect, as if it had never died at all. Sonara Voss was crying. I had never seen a Mallory cry before. I did not know they could. Lieutenant Dren was standing very still, with his hands clasped behind his back, and the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to maintain military composure. Tora had pressed both hands against the glass, and was watching the flower with an expression that needed no translation, regardless of species. The Mallory medical officer was taking readings, and her hands were trembling so badly that she had to brace her instruments against the wall. I looked at my own hands. They were shaking too. Marin watched us with patience and understanding, and something I think was compassion. She had seen this reaction before. The engine is not yet scalable to cosmic levels, she said gently. We can reverse entropy in a contained field. We can restore isolated systems. We cannot yet reverse the heat death of the universe itself. That will require more time, more research, and more minds than humanity possesses alone. She looked at each of us in turn. That is why we sent the pulse, she said. That is why the message said ready. We were not declaring war. We were not claiming territory. We were not announcing ourselves as a superior power. We have done our part. We solved the core problem. But finishing the work, scaling it, applying it to the universe itself, that is too big for one species. We need help. We need all of you. Korath's voice came through the fleet channel, rough and controlled. Why should we trust you? You disappeared for 250 years. You could be lying. You could be using this demonstration to lure us into something we cannot see. Marin nodded. She had expected this. She reached into her jacket and produced a small crystal, a data storage device, unremarkable in appearance. She held it out to Lieutenant Dren. This crystal contains the complete and unredacted science behind the entropy engine, she said. Every equation, every blueprint, every failed experiment, every successful one. The full record of 250 years of work, freely given, with no conditions, no restrictions, and no strings attached. Dren took the crystal carefully, as if it might burn him. Why? He said. Because the universe is dying for all of us, Marin said. We did not build this to own it. We built it to share it. That has always been the plan. From the very first day, from the very first vote, from the moment we closed the door, the plan was always to open it again and give away what we found. Because saving the universe is not something one species can do alone, and it is not something any species has the right to keep for itself. She smiled, and the smile was tired and genuine, and held 250 years of sacrifice in its edges. Go home, she said. Study the data. Argue about it. Verify it independently. Take as long as you need, and when you are ready, come back. We will be here. We have been here for a very long time, and we are very patient. That night, alone in my quarters aboard the Quiet Vigil, I opened my archive terminal and pulled up Earth's file, the file I had maintained for 250 years. I deleted the classification, self-terminated, probable, gone. I stared at the empty field for a long time, then typed 2 words. Status, ascendant. I closed the file and turned off the light and lay in the dark and thought about flowers that bloom after they die. I returned to the Concorde a different person. I suspect every member of that delegation did. It is one thing to meet a civilization more advanced than your own. It is another thing entirely to meet one that suffered more than yours, sacrificed more than yours, and lost more than yours, and then chose to give away the answer for free. The data crystal was delivered to the Concorde Science Council within hours of our return. Every member species received a complete copy simultaneously. There were no negotiations over access, no arguments about distribution rights, no political maneuvering over who would see the data first. Marin Cole had given it freely, and Korath honored that by sharing it freely, and that small act of respect may have been the most important decision anyone made in those early days. The analysis took 3 months. 3 months of every scientist in the Concorde working on the same data set, arguing over the same equations, running the same experiments in their own laboratories with their own instruments and their own methodologies. I was not a scientist, so I watched the process from the edges, the way an archivist watches everything, quietly and carefully, recording what I saw for the generations that would come after. The data was authentic, the science was real. The Mellery were the first to confirm the results. Their computational networks, the most sophisticated in the Concorde, validated the core equations within 6 weeks and published a formal statement that I will paraphrase here because the original was 40 pages long and written in academic Mellery, which is a language designed to obscure meaning behind precision. In simple terms, they said the entropy reversal framework was theoretically sound, experimentally verified on a local scale, and represented the single most significant scientific achievement in the recorded history of the galactic Concorde. Sonara Voss co-authored the verification paper. She told me later that writing it was the hardest thing she had ever done, not because the science was difficult, but because she kept stopping to stare at the equations and feel the weight of what they meant. The Drenari Military Council published their own assessment, which focused not on the science but on the strategic implications. A species capable of dismantling planets, restructuring star systems, and manipulating fundamental physics was, in their words, an existential variable. They noted that humanity had demonstrated no hostile intent, but they also noted that a species with this level of capability did not need hostile intent to be dangerous. An accident, a miscalculation, a political shift within human leadership, any of these could have consequences the Concorde was not equipped to handle. The Vresi were afraid. I do not say this to diminish them. Their fear was rational. They had lost a colony to a spatial anomaly 7 years earlier, 80,000 people gone in an instant, and the idea that a species existed which could manipulate space-time itself terrified them in a way that I understood, even if I did not share it. Their representative spoke at the council, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. And she asked the question that many were thinking, but few had the courage to say aloud. What happens if they change their minds? What happens if they decide they no longer wish to share? The Kailani, who had been characteristically quiet throughout the debate, issued a single statement that was widely circulated. They said that their species had a concept called the long listen, a period of silence undertaken before a major decision, during which a Kailani withdraws from community and focuses entirely on internal understanding. They said that what humanity had done, 250 years of silence followed by a gift, was the largest long listen in galactic history, and that to reject the gift would be to dishonor the silence that produced it. The Concorde fractured. Not violently, not immediately, but the cracks appeared within days of the data's release, and they spread quickly. 2 factions formed, each with its own logic, each with its own fear, and each convinced that the other was wrong. The first faction called themselves the Boundary Coalition. They wanted to maintain the quarantine, strengthen it if necessary, build a second shell around the first one, keep humanity contained until their intentions could be verified over decades, not months. Their argument was not unreasonable. We do not know these people anymore, their leaders said. They left the galaxy 250 years ago, and they came back as something we cannot comprehend. They say they want to share. They say they want to help. But we have only their word, and their word comes attached to a level of power that makes our entire combined military irrelevant. Trust is earned over time, and humanity has spent 250 years earning nothing. The second faction called themselves the Open Threshold. They wanted full collaboration. Immediate, unconditional, total. The universe is dying, their leaders said. Entropy is not a political problem, or a military problem, or a diplomatic problem. It is a physics problem, and the only species that has ever solved it is offering to share the solution. Refusing that offer out of fear is not caution, it is choosing comfort over survival. I attended the debates. I testified again, twice, 3 times, each time presenting the same facts and watching them land differently, depending on who was listening. The Boundary Coalition heard my description of the missing planets and the impossible shell and the structures beyond comprehension, and they heard threat. The Open Threshold heard the same description and heard miracle. The same data, the same words, interpreted through the lens of whatever each listener feared most. I found the debates agonizing, not because the arguments were bad, but because they were both good. The Boundary Coalition was right that trust must be earned through time and transparency. The Open Threshold was right that entropy does not negotiate and does not wait for committees to reach consensus. Both positions were rational. Both were sincere, and only one could win. The vote was held in the High Chamber, on a morning that felt like every other morning, because history rarely announces itself in advance. 312 species voted. The process took 4 hours, because each species was permitted a final statement before casting its decision. I sat in the gallery and recorded every word, because that is what archivists do, and because I knew that whatever happened in that chamber would be remembered for longer than most civilizations last. I remember the Vresi representative, a small gray being with enormous dark eyes, standing at the podium and saying that her species had lost 80,000 people to a force they did not understand, and that she was terrified of a species that could wield such forces deliberately. Her voice did not waver. Her hands did. And then she said that 80,000 deaths would mean nothing if the universe itself died, and that fear of power is a poor reason to reject the only chance anyone has ever had to save everything that exists. She voted for collaboration. I remember Korath standing in his scarred uniform and saying that he had spent his life defending the Concord against threats, and that he did not know how to defend against a species that had no weapons and wanted nothing except help. He said that his tactical training told him to be afraid of what he could not fight, but that his duty told him something else. The purpose of defense is to protect life, he said. If this science can protect all life everywhere, then opposing it is a betrayal of everything I have sworn to defend. He voted for collaboration. I remember the Mellery representative, who said nothing at all, simply cast her vote for collaboration, sat down, and closed her eyes. I remember the Kaylani delegate, Tora, who had been on the original delegation with me. She stood at the podium, and her bioluminescent patterns shifted through every color I had ever seen a Kaylani display, and several I had not. She said that she had touched the glass of the observation chamber and watched a dead flower come back to life, and that she had felt, for the first time in her existence, that the universe was not a story with a predetermined ending. She voted for collaboration. The final count was 219 in favor of collaboration, 93 against. The margin was not as wide as I had hoped, but it was enough. The Concord would work with humanity. The quarantine was lifted. The shell would open. I returned to the Sol system 6 months later as part of the first Concord Human Joint Science mission. The fleet was larger this time, 200 ships from 30 species, carrying thousands of scientists, engineers, diplomats, and a single archivist who had kept a file open for 2.5 centuries and was finally about to see what came next. The shell was different when we arrived. It had not been removed, but it had been changed. Where before it had been opaque and impenetrable, it was now transparent. Sunlight, real sunlight from a real star, streamed outward into interstellar space for the first time in 250 years. I stood at the observation port of the quiet vigil and watched the light reach us, warm and golden, and I felt something that I can only describe as the opposite of grief. Not joy exactly, relief. The relief of a door opening after you have listened to silence on the other side for longer than you thought you could bear. The Sol system was visible from outside for the first time since the silence began. The rings of structures, the gardens, the habitats, the vast machines of unknown purpose, and at the center, glowing with the steady pulse of managed energy, the lattice, the entropy engine, the thing that might save everything. The docking procedures were smoother this time. Humanity had built new ports, larger ones, designed to accommodate ships from every Concord species. The stations were welcoming in a way that felt intentional and careful, as if every detail had been considered by people who remembered what it was like to have guests and had missed it. The corridors were wide and warm and filled with the smell of growing things. Humans moved through them with the calm efficiency of people who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Marin Cole met us at the primary docking bay. She looked the same as before, calm and steady, but I noticed something I had missed on our first meeting. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a bad night or a long shift. The kind of tired that comes from holding something together for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to let go. The kind of tired that settles into your bones and stays there, not as weakness but as evidence of what you have endured. She greeted us with the same warmth as before, switching languages effortlessly, remembering names she had heard only once 6 months ago. She shook hands with the Mellery scientists and touched foreheads with the Kaylani delegation, and she did it correctly, and I saw Tora's patterns shift to a deep, steady blue. I walked beside her as she led the delegation inward. Around us, thousands of alien scientists were flooding into the Sol system, stepping off their ships and looking up and seeing what humanity had built. And their faces changed the way every face changes, when it encounters something that rewrites its understanding of what is possible. I saw a Drenari weapons specialist, a woman who had spent her career studying instruments of destruction, stand in a garden the size of a continent and weep. I saw a Vresi physicist, one of the species most frightened by humanity's power, sit down on a bench beside a human child who was feeding birds, and neither of them spoke, but both of them watched the birds together, and something passed between them that was older than language. I asked Marin the question I had been carrying since our first meeting, the one I had been afraid to ask because I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. Was it worth it? She did not answer immediately. She looked out at the arriving ships, the alien scientists pouring into the system she had helped maintain, the species that had once dismissed humanity, now walking through the corridors of humanity's greatest achievement. With wonder and humility in their eyes, she looked at the Drenari specialist crying in the garden, and the Vresi physicist sitting with the child, and the Kailani delegates whose patterns were cycling through colors that meant emotions they had no words for. She looked tired and proud, and something else I did not have a word for, something uniquely human, a stubbornness that had outlasted centuries, a refusal to accept limits that the universe itself had imposed, a willingness to suffer in the dark for the chance to bring light to everyone, including species they had never met and might never meet. Ask me in another 250 years, she said, and she smiled. I laughed. It surprised me. I had not laughed in a very long time. The joint mission began that day, and it has not ended. I do not think it will end. The work of scaling the entropy engine to cosmic dimensions is the largest scientific project in the history of the galaxy, and it will take generations, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer. But it has begun, and it has begun with the cooperation of every willing species in the Concord, working alongside the species that made it possible, and that is something that has never happened before. I stayed for 3 weeks before returning home. In those 3 weeks, I watched the galaxy change. I watched a Drenari engineer and a human mathematician solve a problem together that neither could have solved alone, and I watched them celebrate with a handshake that lasted longer than military protocol would normally allow. I watched a Vresi delegation, the species most frightened by humanity's power, present Marin Cole with a gift from their homeworld, a crystal that contained a recording of their creation myth, and Marin held it to her chest and said thank you, in flawless Vresi, and the Vresi ambassador wept openly and did not apologize for it. I watched Kailani scientists and human engineers working side by side in the engine core, their combined expertise moving faster than either species had managed in decades of independent research, and I understood that this was what Marin had meant when she said the work was too big for one species. I returned to my archive one final time. I sat at my terminal, surrounded by the records of 900 worlds and thousands of civilizations, the vast catalog of everything the galaxy has ever been and everything it has lost. And I created a new category. I had categories for every state a civilization could occupy: active, dormant, collapsed, absorbed, extinct, self-terminated. I had 100 variations and subcategories, each one carefully defined, each one used to sort the living from the dead and the remembered from the forgotten. I created a category that had never existed in the history of the archive, one that no one had ever needed, because no civilization had ever earned it. Foundational. A civilization upon which other civilizations are built. A species that does not simply exist within the galaxy, but changes what the galaxy is capable of becoming. A foundation stone for everything that comes after. I filed Earth's record under this new heading. It was the first entry. It was the only entry. And as I typed it, I thought about George Calloway, the teacher who convinced his species to stay the course when everything in them wanted to quit. I thought about Liam Blackwood, the physicist whose paper was ignored for decades because his own species, and every other species in the galaxy, were too comfortable to look at what he was showing them. I thought about Ellen Price, who dismantled a planet and died before she could see what her work became. I thought about Nathan Cross, who survived an accident that killed 14,000 people, and spent his remaining years making sure it never happened again. I thought about the generation that built the infrastructure and never saw the results, and the generation that ran the experiments and buried their failures. and the generation that almost quit and chose to stay, and the generation that finally, after all of it, held a living flower in their hands and knew that death was not the only ending. I thought about Marin Cole, standing at a docking bay with tired eyes and steady hands, welcoming the galaxy into her home. I thought about all the things that silence can mean. I have spent my life cataloging the ways civilizations end. I was the galaxy's foremost expert on silence, on the empty spaces where voices used to be, on the records that stop updating and the files that gather dust. I built my career on the assumption that silence means death, that a species which goes quiet has nothing left to say. And then one small, stubborn, ridiculous species taught me what silence actually means. It does not always mean death. It does not always mean failure. It does not always mean that the voice has been lost. Sometimes, it means that someone, somewhere, is working on something so important that they cannot afford to be interrupted. Sometimes it means that the greatest project in the history of the universe is being built behind a closed door, by people who will not live to see it finished, for the benefit of people they will never meet. The galaxy heard Earth's silence and assumed it was a grave. It was a workshop, and the door is open now.